Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Josh, and we're your farm management hosts. Let's get started.
Well, Happy New Year, Josh. It's great to be on the podcast here with you again for a 2025 season. I'm looking forward to it. And I wonder, as you work in a county extension office, I have worked in a county extension office. Are you looking forward to maybe any new and fresh extension publications or resources that you're excited about for 2025?
Happy New Year, Bruce. It's 2025. It's going to be 2050 before we even know it. We just got done with pesticide in-service, and pesticide in-service, that's where we get all the county educators together to get ready for the upcoming pesticide year. So we just got our new 2025 weed control guide, which is a very useful guide that I use here in the extension office. Anytime I get a call, anytime someone comes in for a question, I whip out the new version of that book. And I'm able to give them a pretty good understanding of which pesticide that they want to lean towards and which one's going to be best for their operation. What about you, Bruce? Is there any new publications that you've seen?
Yeah, what came out late 2024 and into fresh new for 2025 is the 16th edition of the Ohio Agronomy Guide. It's kind of funny, Josh, you and I are kind of farm management podcasts, but here we are talking about production guides, and the Ohio Agronomy Guide I think is really suited well for the 2025 season as we look at narrowing margins of crop profitability and decision making that's on the forefront of many of our farm managers. So when it comes to making good agronomic production related decisions, those have economic consequences. So I think I'm looking forward to the Ohio Agronomy Guide edition, 16th edition for OSU on this publication. Josh, I won't tell you what edition I started with extension with. So it's been a number of years and a number of editions, but it's always nice to have new editions because that new information, the latest research is always embedded into those documents or in those publications. So looking forward to that.
Well, you wrote the original one, didn't you?
Not quite. Not quite, but there was a few editions ago. So, hey, our guest today, Josh, we have a great one, a repeat guest with us. We have Robert Moore. And we're going to be talking about some nuptial agreements today. And Robert is an attorney and a research specialist with the Agriculture and Resource Law program at The Ohio State University. Prior to joining OSU, Robert and his wife Kelly owned Wright Moore Law Co, a law firm in Delaware, Ohio, where they focused on legal services for farmers and landowners. After 18 years of private practice, he joined OSU Extension. And Robert's area of focus is farm succession planning, business entities, and taxation. Over the years, Robert has worked with many family farms in designing and implementing these very important succession plans for the family business operation. So welcome back, Robert.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
As our title of this episode alludes to, we're going to be talking about nuptial agreements in this episode, and it feels like it's a topic that's kind of the elephant in the room or taboo, as you might say. So how do we get started to understand what is a nuptial agreement and why people and farm businesses might really need to or want to consider such an agreement?
Yeah, well, it's definitely one of those topics that may not be the most fun things to talk about, especially with your future spouse, but it's definitely important. And when we talk about prenuptial and postnuptial agreements, I think a good place to start is what assets are marital assets? And that is, if there was to be a divorce, what assets do the spouses have a claim on? Because some assets are non-marital and would not be subject to divorce claims. So what Ohio law says is generally assets that are earned during the marriage are marital assets, and the presumption is that each spouse is entitled to an equal share of those assets unless there's unique circumstances. Assets that are inherited or gifted are not marital assets. Now, where it gets gray and where a lot of divorce litigation comes up is the law also says that even if you have inherited an asset, been gifted an asset, or brought that asset to the marriage, if it increases in value during the marriage due to the efforts of either spouse, the appreciation becomes a marital asset. So quick example of that might be one spouse inherits a farm while they're married. Well, on day one, that farm is not a marital asset, it's not subject to a divorce. But let's say one of the spouses farms that farm, puts tile in the ground, improves soil fertility, puts up a building. Now, all that appreciation in value is likely a marital asset. So now both spouses would be entitled to some portion of that asset. So that's why it can get a little gray, and it's not as easy as just saying gifted and inherited assets are not marital assets.
So, Robert, how does postnuptial agreements differ to the prenuptial?
Yeah, so we're all pretty familiar with prenuptial agreements. It's just essentially a contract between two people pre-marriage that says, well, ahead of time, we're going to agree what assets are marital assets and what assets we're going to keep different. It's just a contract between two people. Up until about a year ago, Ohio did not allow postnuptial agreements. So post obviously is after marriage. So now we have the ability in Ohio that even after someone is married, they can still enter into some type of marital agreement where they agree how they would divide things up in case of a divorce or a death. Also, postnuptial agreements can also be thought of. Sometimes the premarital agreement will need amended. So technically that becomes a postnuptial agreement as well. But yeah, Ohio was the 49th state to get postnuptial agreement. Iowa is the only state that currently doesn't have them. I don't know that many people do postnuptial agreements, but it's definitely there if needed. Where postnuptial agreements might come into place is maybe two people get married when they're young and don't really own anything yet, and over time they accumulate wealth, and maybe they want to have an agreement on how that would be divided in case of divorce or death. So there are places for postnuptial, but not nearly as common as the prenuptial agreements.
So, Robert, what are some of the myths or differences that surrounds these two types of agreements that you've seen?
The difference I see with, let's just call them prenuptial agreements, but applies to both pre and post. Typically, when we do some kind of a contract, the law tries to keep people bound to those contracts, and courts are reluctant to let people out of contracts because you signed the agreement and what it says, and it's kind of hard to get out of them. Prenuptials are a little bit different in that it is easier to get out of prenuptial agreements, and judges will more often than other types of contracts give parties, at least give them an argument to get out of the contract. So one example of when a court might let one of the parties out of the contract is if one party has pressured the other into signing it. A judge may say, you can't pressure each other, I'm going to let you out of the agreement. If one party didn't disclose all the assets they own prior to signing the agreement, the judge may say, well, that's unfair because the other party didn't know what all assets were involved, so it's unfair to bind them to this contract. So I would say that's the one thing with prenuptial agreements is we tend to see judges and courts maybe are a little more apt to let parties out of these type of agreements versus just other types of contracts, probably not as easy to get out of them.
Robert, I don't know if you know this, but I just got engaged in 2024. So with all the discussion that we're having right now, wedding planning, what flowers, what type of food we want, how do we start this conversation? Is there a specific method that's typically used? Do I just send her a link to this podcast and just say, hey, listen to this real quick?
So, Josh, you're looking for free legal advice. I get it. Now I know why you invited me back. So
I sure am.
So this is a really important question because how do you get this conversation started? I was sitting at a conference room table with two people one time, and we were talking about a prenuptial agreement, and some issues came up that hadn't been addressed before, and those people did not get married. So it can happen. But it's important for many of our farm families to address this issue. And that's because it could be that we're bringing in a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law in the family that already has an established farming operation, that may own land and other assets that are really critical to not only the family farming business, but also to the family heritage. So they are important. The best way, I think, to bring it up is to blame it on somebody else. And by that, I mean, say, hey, my attorney said we ought to talk about a prenuptial agreement. Or mom and dad or grandma and grandpa said, we really need a prenuptial agreement if I'm going to come into the farming operation. I think that's the best way. And in a lot of ways, that's true, because the prenuptial agreement is protecting the rest of the family, not just you. So, I think you bring it up to the other spouses. Look, in order for me to have the best business opportunity in the family farm, the other family members, my attorney, they really think we ought to address this prenuptial agreement. It will protect both of us. Let's talk about it and see if we can get it worked out. For a young person, there's your free legal advice. Blame your attorney.
Robert, it is really good advice, and examples sometimes offer a little insight as well. And I wondered, can you give some examples of some prenuptials that a family farm or a farming operation might want to consider or need to consider?
Yeah, so this is kind of what I was talking about before, but it's very common. And let's say we have grandson getting married, and we've got a well-established large family farm, and mom and dad or grandma and grandpa are like, well, hey, we're great you're getting married. We're happy for you. But if we bring you into this farming operation, we really don't want to have to buy it back someday. And that's why I'm saying without a prenuptial agreement, there could be some reluctance of the next generations bringing you in as fast as they might, or bringing that next generation in as a big owner as maybe there would be an opportunity for. So it's really just protecting that already established farming operation from divorce. And if I'm mom and dad, or I'm grandma and grandpa, I want a prenuptial agreement. So, we just got to look at it. It's nothing personal. That's easy for me to say as the attorney, but we just got to try to look at it as it's not personal. It's just business. It's to protect the family farm. We just need to get it in place. And once it's in place, hopefully we never need it, and let's just move on.
Robert, you already mentioned that the postnuptial, it's fairly new to Ohio. Can you give us an example of what that may look like for a family farm?
Yeah, so the prenuptial and postnuptial would be almost the same thing. It's more of just when do you put it in place. But I'll go back to that example. Two young people get married, they don't own anything, and then over time, they build up some assets, build up some wealth, and they're just like, if something would happen, why don't we go ahead and sort this out now while we're on good terms? And because I want my stuff to go to my family, you want your stuff to go to your family. Let's just work that out now. Now, again, postnuptial agreements, I think, are pretty rare. I think it would more likely be an amendment of the prenuptial agreement due to circumstances changing or assets changing. But they both work the same way. It's just one is before marriage and one is after marriage.
What about a second marriage? Is that one of those times when we would consider when should the agreement be put into place?
We see prenuptial agreements much more on second marriages, because at second marriage, obviously, they're going to be a little bit older. They may already both have established some wealth. They may have children from previous marriages. So, yeah, it's pretty common for second marriages. And I think also it's usually easier to discuss at that point because people are a little older. They already have their own assets. They've already been through one marriage, so they understand marriages can end. So very common for second marriages. And again, it protects both spouses. It protects the children of both spouses. So they're not one-sided. They protect both sides. So second marriages are a great time to do them. As far as when, the timing is important, not only which marriage it is, but for young people, I tell them, don't wait till the day of the wedding to get your prenuptial agreement signed, because it's very possible that would not be enforceable. So you should get your prenuptial agreement signed and agreed to. I would say try to at least a month before the wedding. And really the best time is before invitations go out, before money is spent on the wedding, because an argument to be made is, we already put a deposit on the wedding. I couldn't back out. I had to sign it. Or we already sent the invitations out. I couldn't back out. I'd be humiliated. So I just signed this prenuptial agreement and I didn't want to, but it was too late. It's those kind of arguments that could cause a prenuptial agreement to get thrown out. So start the discussion well ahead of the actual wedding.
So irrevocable sometimes comes up in conversations, or is that an undo button? What if how irrevocable would this agreement be amongst the parties?
It would be irrevocable without the consent of both parties. So once it's signed, that's the agreement, and neither party can arbitrarily change it. Now, with the postnuptial agreement that we now have in Ohio, they can at least be amended. Before this law changed, once you signed your prenuptial agreement, even if you both parties wanted to agree to change it, they couldn't, which that always seemed really ridiculous to me, that two willing adults couldn't change their agreement, but that's what the law said. But now they at least can. Another way you can kind of get around the agreement to some degree is, let's say the prenuptial agreement says, hey, this farm is going to be separate. It's the husband's property, and it is not to ever be the wife's property. If you want to get around the agreement, the husband can always put the wife's name on the farm deed too. So there's some ways you can kind of void some of the agreement by acting counter to the terms in the agreement. I wouldn't advise that, but it happens sometimes. People forget what's in the prenup, or they've been married for 30 years and it's pretty safe. They're not getting divorced at this point. So maybe they don't worry about the prenuptial agreement too much. That's why you need to review the prenuptial agreement carefully. You should have your attorney review it. You should make sure you fully understand it. You should understand what protection it provides you. And also, just as important is how it protects your spouse and what it prevents you from doing. So once you sign it, you should expect to be bound to it.
So for our listeners at home, we need to wrap this conversation up quick because I'm getting charged by the hour. Robert, do you have any final thoughts for us before we let you go today?
Yeah, I would just say prenuptial agreements are an important tool in our farm management strategies. Like I started off by saying, they're not the funnest thing to talk about, but especially for farming established and have built up some wealth and success, bringing in that next generation can be a little bit scary. But prenuptial agreements can help mitigate some of that risk. And it's just another tool in our management toolbox that we just need to be aware of and use when appropriate.
Thanks for listening today.
For more information about farm management tips, be sure to check out the Farm Office at farmoffice.osu.edu.